I feel like I need to bring this back a bit because, well, back to my mom. I get lost in a lot of this narrative because there's so many different details and a lot's happening. Now, in the 1940s, my mom is coming up, right? She's 6 to 16, so this is the period of time I want to focus on a little bit. I feel like there's these pieces of history that people have that they've lived through and they're walking around with, and it's a part of who they are and what they do, and they react to it. It's real. And my mother, her life was set up by both her mother and her grandmother in ways that maybe even society wasn't really quite ready for. I get the feeling that Sally Lipsmith, no matter what happened, she had a child, my grandmother, and she wasn't married. And I'm assuming that they were in a fairly conservative society at that time. But again, what conservative was like, we really don't know because so many things are up in the air. People from my mother's side of the family fled Lithuania after decades of pogroms and the like, and they did whatever they could to survive. That's why some of it sounds so crazy, like going to South Africa to raise ostrich, but it's either that or stay in the village in which you grew up in and get killed. Lithuania, while it had been a peaceful place for Jews for centuries, by the end of World War II, it was one of the sites of the most complete genocide in the entire Holocaust, where just 90% and more of every Jew that had lived there was gone. So the motivations for these choices is there. And I guess this all brings me the whole question of my mother's Judaism, when I never knew about it, when my grandmother knew about it, Jacob most definitely knew about it, my grandfather, and Pearl definitely knew about it. One of the strange things that I always find in this is that Pearl Grover, when she gets married in 1946, is still signing my mother's report cards, Pearl Zeev Grover, not Pearl Hamp Grover. I mean, at that point, she's divorced, and I would assume that maybe she'd go back to her her maiden name. But for some reason, she kept that. And I don't know what that was caused by. Whether or not there was just somebody difficult about the paperwork and letting her change the name, it's totally possible. But either way, it was a part of what she did, and she signed her things that way. In all of these report cards, for example, any signature she has after 1946, it's Pearl Z. Grover or P.Z. Grover. She, on some level, embraced the name. And my mother did not. So in 1940, my mother's in Queens, and we have some evidence of some of the first schools that she's at. And schools at this time were crowded. New York City had been massively expanding. As I think I said in the last episode, it wasn't just a matter of immigration, although specifically Jewish immigration into New York at this time was massive. The population of the number of Jews coming into New York, it went up 5 or 6-fold. It was absolutely huge since 1880 until about 1912 and on. It was a lot. And with that came the massive moves of anti-Semitism in the United States as well. The 1920s were terrible for this, but the 1940s were as well. There was another really big time of it right after World War II where, they just came back from defeating the Nazis and everything, but anti-Semitism is in full swing in the United States. And it very neatly, after the war, went from, we're fighting the Nazis to defend the Jews, to protect America, or whatever the heck it is. And now we are shifting into the Cold War almost immediately. The pivot was so fast. 1946, the war's over. In the aftermath, they're still saying some nice things. There's some very important little films that came out at the time.
Look, fellas, religion makes no difference, except maybe to a Nazi or somebody as stupid.
And then, 1947, there's the pivot into the Red Scare, the Red Menace, and there's no real pause between people saying, Jews are bad for America, to Jews are the cause of World War II, to Jews are communists and lefties and so on. Like, it goes straight to it. So that level of anti-Semitism was really resilient in the United States, but it was changing a little bit. But again, at that time too, from what I understand, I wasn't raised Jewish. I was barely raised. I was raised Christian, but it was like such a mixed mess of an affair. It's like my mom didn't really kind of know what to do with religion, so they just stuff, like Sunday you go to church. I personally went to like 5 different churches when I was growing up, 5 different kind of religions. Protestantism's a little weird like that. Let me see. Born Lutheran. My mom got married in a Lutheran church with my dad, so they had that going on. But then my parents just weren't going to church in the 70s. So I became a Baptist. Parents didn't. I did, because the Baptists had a bus. And they sent the bus around on Sunday mornings, and they'd pick you up. So the kids would go there. My parents would be staying at home, drinking coffee, getting over the hangover, whatever the hell it was. And I'd be on the bus in the 70s and 80s to go get, the Baptists. Little later on, more of their friends were going over to a Methodist church. It was actually kind of a nice church. And so my parents became Methodist. Suddenly we went from Lutheran to Baptist to Methodist. And I know that there was some other kind of snake-handly kind of church revival, born-again stuff in the middle there. Sorry for those who are of such and such backgrounds, but I've got to tell you, the ones experiences that I had in the 80s, tent revivals on Long Island, were not persuasive to me. But funny enough, I think this is one of the things that that got Sally interested in Hubert Hamp. So my great-great-grandfather, I think one of the things that she was drawn to with him was he was like a born-again. And I believe he was actually Jewish and then, converted. And so she kind of was into converting, but she didn't. And then she had an arranged marriage for her daughter, my grandmother, to an immigrant from Lithuania who was Jewish. And so she arranged a Jewish marriage. And then Pearl did convert later on with Edward Grover, but she never got rid of that Ziv name. She never quite got rid of it. So I don't know what my mom did with Judaism, but she did not talk about it. But again, it's the time. Like, the time allowed my mother to do these things. Women's rights were coming along just a little bit, white women's rights in this case. And the opportunity was there. In the same way that my great-great-great-grandfather came to New York to disappear, in the 50s, the suburbs were the place where you could leave it behind. They could leave behind Brooklyn. They could be different people. She could change her name, change her place. She could wear the mask until the mask became the reality. And the 50s was all about this beautiful pretense of things. My mother looks like glamorous in these pictures. The life of it looks beautiful and simple. And yet we also know at the same time there's so many problems in the 50s and so much stress and everything from the Red Scare to the fear of nuclear Armageddon and massive racism and none of this would have been my mother's concern. My parents were kind of the typical racists of the day, and they wouldn't have wanted to change it. I don't think they would have even seen it. But my mother had an opportunity to build a separate life and to leave the things that she hated in Brooklyn behind. And the conditions were set so that a young woman could get a job, do well, save money, and move her family out. And it helped. The conditions for the way homes were being developed, the fact that she was white, helped in order to make that happen. All these things were coinciding with my family's move to the newly expanding suburbs of Long Island. The story that my mother always tells from this period, the 1940s, is about how they used to take my uncle, who's my oldest uncle, and dress him up like a little girl and shove him into like the dockside bars to sing. They remember they were so specific. They put a little kerchief, a little babushka around his head. My mother always called it a babushka. She'd wrap a little thing around his head and shove this boy, who was probably 5 years old, into a bar full of like gruff longshoremen to sing and get money thrown at him. And then they would beat him up and take the money. This got told a lot. This is one of those stories that was my mother's regular repertoire. It would always get rolled out. Always when my uncle was there. Always when my oldest aunt was there. And it would be something that would make my uncle not a quiet guy. Not a humble guy. And he would go very quiet. And he would let his sisters talk about it. And you could see the kind of anger that he had about it, or frustration, or shame, or I don't even know, but it was joking, it was fun, it was a good story. It's such a funny thing, these things coexist. The whole idea about certain things of trauma, I guess that's always a bit about this is, yeah, there's the trauma, yes, it's also tragic and funny, and yet there's a weird kind of beauty in that also. As weird and fucked up as that is to say, it's just true, it happens. There's an incredible beauty and a resilience and a humor in the middle of all of this, and yet at the same time I didn't understand it. I didn't really see my mother as a human being, unfortunately, until after she was dead. There were glimmers, but I don't actually think she would have wanted it that way. Being seen as a person by her child was just not in my mother's like toolkit. It wasn't even that it was available. It wouldn't have even been something that she wanted. It wasn't in her universe. My mother found her satisfaction and expressed her love for me in other ways. And I guess in some weird way, my uncle expressed his love for my mom and his older sister by letting him roll out that humiliating story again, just because they clearly loved it so much. And sometimes it's like that too.